Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. I wanted to address one of the most commonly asked questions that I've seen online, which is patch 3.22 going to be a major overhaul of Endgame, i.e. an Atlas expansion, as many players call them? The answer is there's not really such a thing anymore, and that 3.22 will be a bigger in scope expansion than something like 3.14, 15 or 16 that didn't change the Endgame very much at all, but it will be smaller in scope than something like 3.17 or 3.13 or 3.9, the ones that completely transformed it. Let's just quickly go into some details though. For a few years, Grinding Gear Games' approach was that once every 1 to 2 years, they would do a sizable overhaul of the endgame. This started with patch 2.4 and the Atlas of Worlds. This added the Shaper, it added his mini-bosses, it added Sextants, it added selective changes to map tiers that you could make through the use of Shaper's Orbs, and a whole bunch of other things. Patch 3.1 was next, War for the Atlas. This added the Elder encounter. Uber Elder would be held back a league. You'd get influenced items, you'd get the Elder's Orb, and this Atlas became a war between the Shaper and the Elder. Now, this incarnation of the Atlas was almost completely unchanged. From patch 3.2, when Uber Elder was added, all the way through to patch 3.8. There was very little that changed in the Atlas endgame during this period. There were a couple of little balance changes around mechanics like Sextant blocking, but mostly the Atlas stayed the same, and you could follow an Atlas guide that was made in patch 3.2 as late as patch 3.8 and it would be fine. Patch 3.9 introduced the Conquerors of the Atlas and completely overhauled everything. So everything you thought you knew, you had to learn again. This introduced the 8-region Atlas, replaced the Shaper versus Elder struggle with the 4 Conquerors and Cirrus, the Awakener of Worlds, and totally overhauled the way that you progressed through the Atlas. 3.13 overhauled things again by adding in the Maven, adding in region-specific Atlas passive trees, and a whole bunch of other things, and then 3.17 shook things up once more. However, at one point in a Q&A that I can no longer seem to find online, Grinding Gear Games stated that they wanted to no longer hold back improvements to the Atlas until there was a whole bunch of them ready to go at once. And so what they've done since then is, instead of having these big overhauls followed by a bunch of smaller patches, they now try to release those changes when they're ready and try to have some of them in each new expansion. So in 3.18, we got all of the Atlas Keystones that are currently on the passive tree, except I think 1 or 2 of them that were added later. 20 Atlas Keystones were added in 3.18. This included 6 that were dedicated to the 7 Uber Pinnacle bosses, because Uber Shaper and Uber Duber Elder share the same one. It also included things like Wandering Path, Singular Focus, Stream of Consciousness, and a couple of niche things like Twist of Fate as well. And also 3.18 added in the Atlas Mechanic Blockers. 3.19, they went a bit more experimental and added in the Atlas Memories. These, I feel, didn't quite achieve what they were going for. I feel like the intention Grinding Gear Games had when they added Atlas Memories was to give you a bit of a trial run of what a very differently spec'd Atlas might feel like to play, but I don't think they quite nailed that with these, and instead some of them became mostly forgotten, like Elva's Memory of Reverse Incursions, and others became huge loot drops, like the ones that relate to Harvest, one of which was added in 3.19, one of which was added in 3.20. 3.20 did less in the way of adding new mechanics to the Atlas than a lot of the previous patches. What it did mostly was add a whole bunch of Gigabuffed Atlas support for some of the blockable mechanics. So mechanics like Heist, Legion, Ritual, all of these received quite a lot more support on the Atlas passive tree. Additionally, there were a couple of new memories that were added in 3.20 as well. 3.21 went back to adding a new feature to the Atlas, and this was the addition of the gateways, which allow you to jump from one side of the Atlas to the other. Unfortunately, I find that they usually cost about 1 point too much to recommend using, and as a result, I don't find myself using them very often. It's not that they're complete rubbish, it's just that they're not quite good enough in most cases. So what's 3.22 bringing? It's going to be a repeat of 3.18 in many ways. It's going to be another season full of Keystones. But where 3.18s were mostly focused on people who are very deep into Endgame, things like adding the Uber Pinnacle bosses, 3.22's Keystones look like they're going to be something that will be accessible a little bit earlier in progression. So there's going to be 20 new Atlas Keystones. We know that one of them is going to triple the radius of your expedition bombs, but is also going to restrict you to only one of these expedition bombs. And presumably the others will be thematically similar. They will change the way that you play some familiar Atlas content. Many of them are tied to existing mechanics, and I think that they will play out like a new Notable would, except that they'll have bigger upsides than the Notable can have, but they will also have downsides attached to them. No boss-related ones have been announced as yet. I think for most players, 1 or 2 of these new Keystones will speak to you personally. It'll be something that you'll look at and you'll say, hey, that looks really interesting, I want to build an Atlas around it. And you'll play around with those, they will transform the way Endgame feels, but the rest of them you'll just completely ignore. And I think that's a reasonable spot for a mechanic to be in. Anyways, that's the long version of the answer to the question, is 3.22 an Atlas expansion? The short version being, it's 25% of one. May Overhauls have interesting results, and I will see you around.